My parents booted me out at 18 and left me homeless. 10 years later, they lost everything to bankruptcy and squatted in my home while I was away, so I made them experience my pain. My parents didn't want kids. I was an only child, and pretty much an accidental pregnancy from what relatives have told me, as my parents claimed that they were going to be child-free when they married. My childhood was initially good, but after I started growing out of the cute phase, my parents were less inclined to spend time with me. They both worked and had their own business, which they started together. That business was their life, and I was always second fiddle to it. Any other close members of the family, like my grandparents, lived states away, and I barely knew anything about them till I was an adult. So, I had no other family around my entire childhood. I was practically raised by TV and my school teachers. My own birthdays by the time I became a teenager were often spent without my parents, as they just give me some money and tell me to go out and buy whatever I wanted. It was more or less the same with Christmas, and sometimes even back to school shopping. We wouldn't have even had a Christmas tree after I turned 10 if it weren't for the fact I convinced my parents to buy a fake one I could build up and then take apart later every year. Suppose I were to describe my parents. Think of them as those people who always wear black, drink lots of wine, and look down their noses at people. And the last I saw of my parents, they still looked and acted the same way. After I turned 18, my parents told me that since I was an adult, they expected me to move out as soon as I was able. I was working part-time because I was still in high school, and I didn't have anywhere near enough saved for college. And not long after high school ended, my parents told me to pack up and move out. They got an official eviction notice that gave me 30 days and everything. They didn't even help me move. I had to get help from a friend's dad, who owns a truck. I ended up renting a crappy apartment and working retail. I had no real life experience and no time for college. I went broke pretty fast because I was terrible at managing my own money and couldn't find steady employment. So I lost my apartment. I ended up homeless and living out of a tent in someone's backyard in winter. My friends had all moved on to college, some in other states, and I was a broke kid taking whatever work I could to stay alive. My salvation came when one of the neighbors of my parents found out I was living out of a tent and offered to take me in for a little while so I wouldn't freeze. She helped me badger my parents into telling me how to get in touch with the other members of my estranged family. My parents did not want to say. My guess is out of fear of being judged for throwing their son out the way they did. But they coughed up the info and gave me a list of contact details, and then told me not to bother them ever again. I called my grandparents from my father's side of the family, and they were very surprised and happy to hear from me because they hadn't seen me since I was an infant, and I'm their only grandchild. After finding out my situation, my grandparents flew me over to live with them as soon as they could. They basically adopted me. My grandparents said they despised my parents for treating me so poorly and legally disowned them by striking them from their wills. My parents, I'm told, were not happy to hear that, but also said it didn't really matter because they were plenty well off and didn't need anything from my grandparents. How wrong that statement turned out to be. After about a year of living with my grandparents, I was able to afford to start going to community college. I got an associate degree and got a decent job. Eventually, my grandparents offered to sell me their house so they could retire to Arizona. My grandma wanted to live in a warmer climate as the cold winter was getting harder and harder on her health every year. I was sad to see them go, but I happily bought the house. They sold it to me for 1/3 its value, and I'll have it paid off in a few more years. Then one day in late 2020 I came home after being away for over 2 weeks, only to find a large white van I did not recognize in my driveway. I was getting ready to call the police when I noticed the van had the logo from my parents' business on the side of it, and I felt dread. Yes, my parents were there. They'd broken in somehow and were living out of my home, and they had the nerve to greet me like we were buddies the moment I walked in. I told them to get the hell out, and they refused because it was Grandma and Grandpa's house. I said it wasn't their house anymore. They'd sold it to me when they retired. We argued, and they refused to leave. My father told me it was his parents' house first, and that meant he and my mother had the right to live there if they wanted. I walked right into my bedroom, locked the door, and called the police. When the cops showed up, they were of no help. My parents claimed to them that they had already been there long enough to have residency, which was a complete lie. They told police they had a verbal rental agreement with me and that I was trying to illegally evict them for no reason. My mother even put on the waterworks when saying that. The police told me it was a family dispute and to file an eviction with the courts to get them out. Meanwhile, my parents are squatting in my house rent-free and rubbing it in my face. From the information I got out of them, their business went bankrupt, and they sold off almost everything they had to pay their debts. All they had left was the van and a few personal belongings. So they expected to live in my house rent-free for the foreseeable future. They were working too. Both of them soon got new jobs. My father was a delivery driver, and my mother was a sales associate. They were making money, and the only things they contributed to were electricity and water utilities, which was basically just handing me a $100 bill every month and saying I should be grateful they were paying me anything. Anytime I tried to discuss proper rent with them, they just said I owed it to them to live rent-free because I took 18 years of their lives, and it's not like they were demanding the money back for that time. Then threatened to stop helping with the utilities altogether. I'd already filed for a legal eviction and would get it soon enough, and my parents already knew that they were on borrowed time. I made sure to say that in earshot of my parents too. They responded with the silent treatment. My father was away most of the time, driving a delivery vehicle 6 days a week, which was a job really not to his liking, and my mother basically tried to take over my house in her spare time. She demanded I let her rearrange my living room and even tried to force me to give her and my father the master bedroom because they were my parents, and they deserved better, as she put it. I vetoed both of those things and said they don't deserve better and to stop trying to act like I owe them anything. And all they were doing was trying to assert dominance to try and keep me from kicking them out. Finally, after 4 months, I managed to take my parents to court over their squatting. The judge ordered that they needed to be out in a maximum of 30 days because they have zero claim on my house. After court, they confronted me and said they were disappointed in me for kicking out my flesh and blood. I couldn't help but laugh and call them hypocrites because that's exactly what they did to me without a care in the world for my well-being. They did not love me, so I have no love for them. I owed them nothing. They just tried to act like everything that was mine was theirs. But they had no right to call themselves my parents because they've never really acted like it. I called them a pair of snobby lying narcissists to their faces and told them to get their affairs in order. Because they already know I won't hesitate to call the police if they don't leave my house when the 30 days are over. That final month was spent with them either guilting me to try and make me change my mind or completely ignoring me. I put up a calendar in the living room and checked off each day before they had to leave with a red marker. And the exact day they were to be out was marked with a big red circle. I still remember that the final day was March 2nd. My parents waited until the exact day they had to leave my home for good before they finally left. Even when all their stuff was out of the house, and they were sleeping on the floor in the guest room for a few days. Since they were so convinced they could make me let them stay, they didn't bother to try and look for an apartment until after the court eviction went through, and my mother spent weeks scrambling to find an apartment. They had to get a tiny and crappy studio apartment in the next city over because it was the only thing they could find on such short notice. A lot like what I had to do when I was 18. Quite ironic. I drove my mother over to see it once, and the apartment was terrible. My mother went out of her way to try and give me sad looks while dropping hints that I should be feeling guilty that I was reducing them to live in such a place. But I just acted oblivious to it all until she finally stopped. They signed the lease immediately and moved what little stuff they had into the apartment over the weekend. They also demanded the queen-size bed, dresser, and flat-screen TV from my guest room. I told them just to take the damn things because I no longer wanted them in the house after they spent 5 months sleeping in that room. They looked at me like I was treating them as though they were diseased and demanded nothing more. When they had to leave for good, I started changing the locks on all exterior doors. All their stuff was at the apartment, and they'd spent their last night in my guest room. They watched me start ripping the old lock off the front door as they entered the van. They said nothing, I said nothing, but they just sat and watched me for a while until I had the new doorknob on. Then they finally left. I breathed a massive sigh of relief the second that van went down the road. I figured karma had finally come for them, and they could live under a rock for all I cared.